Come the 1950s, the Swedish military was still predominantly armed with the M42 tank. Now, as early war tanks go, the M42 really wasn't all that bad. However, by the end of the war, and then early Cold War, you look at the other tanks that were being produced en masse and you realize that a 1942 design with a medium 75 just isn't going to cut it anymore. Initially, the solution was to simply go buy new tanks. Off they went to the British, they bought 80 Centurion Mark IIIs. They entered service initially as the C3 tank. However, then the Swedish designation system changed and they were called STRV 81s as the first tank of the 8 cm category. Still, that was only 80 tanks. The next solution was simply to upgun the M42s, but to do that, you had to enlarge the turret. This brings us to the STRV 74, and it actually only costs about a third as much of a new Centurion. We're going to have a look at the one here at the Arsenal and Museum, and see if this actually is any better than the M42. Looking at the front of the hull, the most obvious difference is that, yes, the hull machine gun has been finally officially deleted and replaced with a sponson box. The headlight is now a much smaller version with some lower intensity ones off to the sides. We do have the low visibility headlight also mounted on the front, similar to the IKV modification. The basic armor remains the 55mm or so on the vertical faces and down to about 3 cm on the glacis. There is one addition, however. These panels here, they are officially described as blast panels. They are for protection, would you believe, in a nuclear attack. So what you would do is quite simply lower it down, and the idea was that when the blast wave came along, it wouldn't go in through the grills and then hit the firewall in front of the driver and shove the steering gear firewall into his face. It was also supposed to be lowered if you're going into a contaminated environment. Now, if you think we're joking, we're not. It is in the manual, and our Swedish translator has verified that's exactly what they are, unless he's lying to us, in which case we'll hit him later. Other items, these low intensity discharge panels, they're basically glow in the dark. And when the tank got heavier, they made the tracks a little bit wider to give more flotation in soft terrain. So as you start to move to the side of the vehicle, you get a much better look at the very large turret. In fact, it's almost difficult to believe that somebody said, hey, let's put a turret this big on the vehicle when the original turret was only so big. Bear in mind that the hull and running gear was really only designed to take a certain weight, so the compromise was that they couldn't put much metal in the turret. Ergo, the thickness of the armor is only 2 to 3 centimeters, which is okay for 1940 perhaps, but by the 1950s, you're basically only talking about stopping heavy caliber machine gun rounds. As you move further down, you can see the jack and a mounting block for it, a tripod for a machine gun should you wish to use it as such. And these little devices here, they're basically emergency grousers. You place them in front of the track when you've lost traction. It gives you a lot more bite, and it'll help pull you out of whatever hole you've gotten yourself into. Moving down to the running gear, remember also, in addition to the wide tracks, the load has to be taken by the suspension units. So the suspension got beefed up most visibly by the replacement of the shocks on the lead and the trail sets of wheels. If you look just after the sprocket wheel, you'll see the addition of a mud and ice scraper. So if there was a little bit too much buildup, what would happen is that the track would no longer feed onto the teeth and you'd lose the track at worst, or at best just lose traction. If you move a little bit further back, we can also see that a new box has been added on the lower hull sides. These stow smoke grenades for the launchers, which have been added to the turret sides. Also, I'll note that the tank is suffering a bit of an identity crisis. The rollers, unsurprisingly, state "Made in Sweden." The wheels, however, say "Made in France." This vehicle was converted from a Scania engined M42, unlike the Volvo engine to M42 on display elsewhere in the museum. As a result, you'd no longer have the grille on the side of the rear hull. If you move around to the back though, other modifications that you will see is the addition of an infantry telephone, a travel lock or gun crutch if you wish to use such terminology. A later addition, not originally on the 74s, was a mounting point for what is effectively a mothball screen. So when this tank was in storage, you circulate hot air through it and it will keep it all nice and dry for long-term storage. The track at the back, you could also find a whole bunch of jerry cans, although not often in photographs because in training you didn't want to risk losing the things. If you look further down, you do see that the exhaust system has been radically changed. Looking up at the turret bustle, you see that there is a lot of stowage space, which is good. The presence of an exhaust pipe does indicate the presence of an auxiliary power unit to keep the tanks running even without the use of the main motor. The large bustle on the huge turret for the 74s necessitated that we actually spend a little bit of time crank it around, and we have saved you the agony of watching me crank. Now we have the hatches open, you can see the engine bay. Only the twin engine vehicles were upgraded. The original 603s are now replaced by 607s. And the main difference is a slight modification on the compression ratio and the replacement of carburetors with fuel injection. Otherwise, the same concept holds true. They are two 6-cylinder engines side by side with two power shafts going forward into a single transfer case towards the front of the vehicle. You can see a lot of items are duplicated. You have oil sumps on both sides, you got air cleaners for both sides, you got two separate cooling systems coming down under the back. If you wanted to start one of these engines in the cold of winter, there was actually an auxiliary heater motor that you would mount on the back of the engine deck, and then that would heat up the system to allow you to run normally. And a lot of the Swedish design tanks had such a facility for cold weather starting. Fuel remains the same, 350 liters, and the maximum speed remains the same, more or less 45 kilometers an hour. So just before we close up part one, a quick tour of the turret exterior and the bustle. You have the wire rail on the left-hand side. They've still managed to hoist that 190 kilogram wheel up on the left-hand side somehow. And underneath here is a new addition, courtesy of Volkswagen. It is a Volkswagen 122. It is a small little auxiliary power unit. It has a 35-liter tank and is rated to run the systems for about 5 liters an hour. You can't run the systems without at least the auxiliary motor going. So that is it for the outside, and we'll see you in part 2.